I woke up that morning expecting the crisp winter air, the smell of fresh pine, and the satisfaction of building a roaring fire in my living room. Instead, I was met with an empty space where my neatly stacked firewood had been the night before. At first, I thought maybe I was losing my mind. Had I miscalculated how much I had left? But no, just yesterday I had spent an hour stacking it perfectly, making sure it was dry and ready for the season. Now it was just gone. Not a single log remained. Someone had taken it. And not just taken a few pieces, they had wiped out my entire supply, right down to the last splinter. Annoyance turned to suspicion as I stomped back inside and pulled up the footage from my security camera. If some desperate raccoon had developed a new taste for firewood, I wanted to see it for myself. But what I saw on the screen was something far worse. There she was. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, the woman who made it her mission to control everything in our neighborhood. She wasn't even trying to be sneaky. Wearing her ever-present smug expression, she strutted up to my firewood pile in broad daylight, barking orders at some clueless neighbor who had the misfortune of crossing her path. With a grand wave of her hand, she gestured for two hired movers, who were apparently in on her latest power trip, to haul my wood into the back of a pickup truck. She didn't hesitate, didn't look around in guilt or hesitation. She simply took it. I felt a mixture of disbelief and fury settle into my bones. She hadn't even tried to hide it. No note, no explanation, no warning. She had just decided, on her own, that my firewood now belonged to the HOA. And the worst part? I already knew exactly what her excuse would be. She would claim it was some kind of violation, that my firewood wasn't aesthetically pleasing enough for her high standards. Or maybe she'd say it was a fire hazard, despite the fact that plenty of people in the neighborhood had the exact same setup. But none of that mattered. Karen made the rules, and Karen decided when to break them. Fueled by indignation, I stormed down the street, straight to her house. She had, of course, decorated it to look like the HOA headquarters, complete with an unnecessary American flag display and a mailbox so pristine it looked like it had been polished that morning. I barely had to knock before she swung the door open, already looking irritated, as if she had expected my visit and considered it an inconvenience. Before I could even get a word out, she put on her fake customer service smile. "Oh, Jake, good morning. What a surprise. What can I do for you?" "You can start by explaining why you stole my firewood," I said, crossing my arms. She had the audacity to scoff. "Stole? Jake, that's a rather strong word, don't you think? I merely repurposed it for the good of the community." I narrowed my eyes. "Repurposed it? Karen, that was my firewood. I paid for it. I stacked it. And now it's gone." Karen tilted her head, as if she were speaking to a particularly slow child. "Jake, you know as well as I do that the HOA has certain standards. Your firewood was unsightly. It was stacked in a way that, frankly, did not match the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I was doing you a favor by removing it." I gritted my teeth. "Karen, it was stacked in my backyard. Nobody could even see it." She waved a dismissive hand. "That's not the point. The HOA's annual bonfire is coming up, and we needed extra firewood. Your pile was the closest and most convenient." I let out a humorless laugh. "So you're telling me you just helped yourself to my firewood because it was convenient for you?" Karen sighed, clearly already bored with this conversation. "Oh, Jake. It's just firewood. I don't see why you're making such a fuss. You can always get more." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. Karen had a way of making everyone feel like they were the crazy ones, like their perfectly reasonable anger was irrational. But I wasn't going to let her gaslight me into thinking I was overreacting. "Fine," I said, stepping back. "If you want to play it that way, Karen, go ahead. Enjoy my firewood. But just know that you've made a huge mistake." Karen gave a condescending laugh. "Oh, Jake. You're always so dramatic. It's just firewood." I turned and walked away, already formulating my next move. Karen had been running this neighborhood like her own personal kingdom for years, bullying people into following her arbitrary rules. But this time, she had messed with the wrong person. She had taken from me, not just out of greed, but out of entitlement, believing there would be no consequences. I went straight to my garage, an idea forming in my head so brilliantly devious that I almost laughed out loud. Karen thought she could take what she wanted without repercussions? Well, I was about to show her just how wrong she was. My hands worked quickly as I dug through my supplies, pulling out the perfect components for my plan. A few hollowed-out logs, a bag of fire ants, tiny creatures with a bite that could make even the toughest person cry, and just enough patience to wait for the perfect moment. Karen had unknowingly declared war, and I had just the perfect way to strike back. I sat in my garage, staring at the hollow logs I had carefully prepared, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction brewing inside me. If Karen wanted to take my firewood without asking, then I would make sure she got exactly what she deserved. There was something poetic about it. She had taken from me under the pretense of community betterment, but now she was about to unknowingly sabotage herself. I reached for the small container beside me, carefully lifting the lid just enough to confirm that my tiny army was still active. The fire ants inside swarmed angrily, their little bodies twitching with energy, completely unaware that they were about to become an essential part of my revenge. I had spent hours making sure the plan would work perfectly. The logs looked just like the ones Karen had stolen, same size, same cut, same natural imperfections. But these were different. Each log had been hollowed out, with small entry points carved just deep enough to allow the ants to nest inside. I had tested a few to make sure they wouldn't escape until they were exposed to the heat of the fire. As soon as the logs started to burn, the ants would panic, swarming in every direction, and that was when the real fun would begin. The vision played out in my mind like a masterpiece. Karen, standing in front of the whole neighborhood, smug as ever, tossing my generous contribution into the flames, completely unaware of what was coming next. I stacked the logs neatly in a pile near the side of my garage, making it look as though I had simply gone out and replaced my stolen firewood. Karen was predictable, and I knew that the moment she saw fresh logs on my property, she wouldn't be able to resist helping herself again. It was a power thing with her. It wasn't about the firewood. It was about proving she could take what she wanted, whenever she wanted. She had done it before, and she would do it again. And when she did, I would be ready. The next morning, I barely had to wait. Just as I was finishing my coffee, I glanced out the window and saw her standing at the edge of my yard, hands on her hips, her signature scowl locked onto my neatly stacked logs. She didn't even hesitate. With the same audacity as before, she marched over, waving for her hired movers, directing them to load the wood into her truck, as if she were conducting a symphony. I could hear her self-important voice even from inside my house, barking orders about how this was necessary for the HOA event. I leaned back, smiling to myself as they drove away. Everything was set. Now all I had to do was wait. That evening, the neighborhood gathered at the HOA's annual bonfire event. Karen, as expected, stood front and center, basking in the attention of the residents. She had a microphone in hand, her voice ringing through the crowd as she went on and on about bringing the community together, and sacrificing her own time to ensure a wonderful event for everyone. She was soaking up the admiration like a sponge, unaware that her moment of triumph was about to become her moment of humiliation. The fire pit crackled with warmth as people gathered around, sipping hot cider and chatting. Karen, in her typical fashion, insisted on having the honor of throwing in the first log. She made a dramatic show of picking up one of the hollowed logs, holding it above her head like it was some kind of ceremonial offering, then tossed it into the flames with a flourish. The crowd cheered, the wood caught quickly, and for a brief moment everything was normal. Then the ants woke up. At first, it was just a few. Tiny, confused creatures, disoriented by the sudden heat, crawling their way out of the log in search of escape. But within seconds it was an absolute swarm. Dozens turned to hundreds, then to thousands, all fleeing the flames in pure survival mode. The fire pit exploded into chaos as ants poured out in every direction, landing on shoes, crawling up legs, and biting anything in their path. The screams started small but quickly escalated as the full force of the infestation hit the crowd. Karen, standing closest to the fire, was the first victim. She let out an ear-piercing shriek, swatting wildly at her arms as ants crawled up her sleeves, down her back, and into her hair. She stumbled backward, crashing into the refreshments table, knocking over a massive bowl of cider, which spilled all over her clothes, soaking her just as the ants really started to bite. The panic spread like wildfire. People jumped from their seats, toppling chairs, knocking over tables, tripping over one another in their desperate attempt to escape the growing wave of ants. Someone knocked over a plate of marshmallows, which promptly stuck to Karen's cider-soaked clothes, turning her into a human sticky trap for the frenzied insects. She thrashed and spun in circles, screaming about fire hazards and bioterrorism, while the entire neighborhood looked on in shock. The HOA vice president, an elderly woman named Barbara, was the first to regain her composure. "Somebody help her!" she shouted, but nobody was brave enough to get close. Karen, still flailing, tripped over a fallen chair and landed face-first into the remains of the marshmallow station. When she sat up, her face was plastered with melted marshmallow, her hair a tangled mess of sugar and fire ant. The scene was so ridiculous, so utterly perfect, that I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. The ants were still going strong, and Karen, realizing she was getting no immediate help, made the only decision she could: she ran. She sprinted past the crowd, through the park, and straight into the lake at the edge of the event space. With an unceremonious splash, she threw herself into the water, emerging seconds later, gasping and flailing, her carefully styled hair now dripping over her face like a defeated sea monster. The neighborhood stood frozen, watching in stunned silence. Then, slowly, the first chuckles started. They spread like ripples in a pond, until the entire gathering was shaking with laughter. Even Barbara, still clutching her clipboard, was doubled over, tears streaming down her face. Karen, humiliated, crawled out of the water, her once perfect image now in shambles. She stomped towards her car, soaking wet, covered in marshmallow, her pride in absolute ruins. She didn't bother making a speech, didn't try to regain control of the night. She just got into her car, slammed the door, and drove off into the darkness, leaving behind a bonfire event that would be talked about for years to come. I stood near the back of the crowd, sipping my cider, enjoying every second of it. Karen had finally faced the consequences of her entitlement. And the best part? She had done it to herself. As I turned to leave, a few neighbors caught my eye, giving me knowing looks. They didn't say anything, but their smirk said enough. They knew. They knew I had something to do with this, but none of them would ever say a word. The night was a triumph, and as I walked home, listening to the distant echoes of laughter, I knew one thing for sure: Karen's reign of terror was officially over. The aftermath of the bonfire disaster spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the time I woke up the next morning, the entire street was buzzing with whispers, texts were flying, and a few neighbors were still laughing about the sight of Karen running into the lake covered in marshmallow and fire ant. It was the kind of event people would talk about for years, the story morphing and growing with every retelling. Some claimed Karen had screamed so loudly that she startled every dog within a 5-mile radius. Others said she had swallowed a marshmallow whole while flailing and nearly choked. Every version got a little more ridiculous, and I was more than happy to let the legend evolve. Karen, however, was nowhere to be seen. Her house, which was usually a hive of self-important activity, stood eerily quiet. No early morning HOA notices taped to people's doors, no passive-aggressive emails about trash bins being left out for too long. It was as if the Queen had abandoned her throne. I figured she was licking her wounds, plotting her next power move, trying to find a way to spin the story so that she wasn't the villain. That was Karen's way. She never admitted defeat, never backed down, no matter how obvious it was that she had lost. By the afternoon, the first official sign of Karen's attempt at damage control appeared in the form of an email, subject line: Urgent HOA meeting, attendance mandatory. The wording was as dramatic as ever, full of phrases like gross misconduct, serious safety violations, and threats to neighborhood stability. It was clear she intended to frame herself as the victim, to convince everyone that the bonfire disaster had been an act of sabotage against her personally. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. The meeting was held in the community center, and by the time I arrived, the room was packed. People were crammed into chairs, standing along the walls, all murmuring amongst themselves. A few turned and gave me knowing smirks as I walked in, their eyes twinkling with barely contained amusement. Karen was already seated at the front, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. Gone was her usual prim and proper composure. Her hair was still a little frizzy from its unfortunate dip in the lake, and her expression was tight with frustration. She was trying to maintain control, but she had lost something important the night before: her authority. She cleared her throat, attempting to regain her usual air of superiority. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice a little too sharp, a little too forced. "We have a very serious issue to address today. Last night's bonfire event was a disaster, a disgrace to our community, and it was all due to a deliberate act of vandalism." A few scattered chuckles rippled through the crowd, but Karen ignored them, pressing on. "Someone," she continued, her eyes scanning the room, lingering on me for a second too long, "intentionally tampered with the firewood. That person put hazardous, insect-infested logs into the pile, causing chaos, injury, and reputational damage to the HOA. This is an attack on our very way of life, and I demand that the responsible party be held accountable." She paused for dramatic effect, expecting a wave of agreement. Instead, the room remained awkwardly silent. A few people exchanged glances, and then, from the back, someone snickered. Karen's jaw tightened. Barbara, the HOA vice president, finally spoke up, her voice slow and measured. "Karen, before we start throwing around accusations, maybe we should discuss the real issue here. Like how the firewood got there in the first place." Karen blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone suddenly defensive. Barbara leaned forward, clasping her hands together. "Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you take that firewood from Jake's property without his permission?" A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. Karen's face twitched, but she forced out a laugh. "Oh, please. It was for the benefit of the community. His firewood was in violation of aesthetic standards." Barbara raised an eyebrow. "You mean the same aesthetic standards that don't actually exist in the HOA guidelines?" Karen stiffened, her carefully constructed argument crumbling. "I was acting in the best interest of—" Another voice cut in, this time from old Mr. Thompson, one of the longest-standing residents. "Karen, you stole that man's firewood. Then you threw it into the bonfire in front of the whole neighborhood. And now you're mad because it backfired on you. Sounds like karma to me." Laughter erupted, louder this time. Karen's face flushed deep red, her composure slipping by the second. She had spent years bullying people, twisting rules to suit her needs, acting as if she was above everyone else. But now, the spell was broken. People weren't afraid of her anymore. They were openly mocking her, questioning her authority. And she knew it. "I move to have a vote," Barbara announced, cutting through the noise. "A vote to remove Karen from her position as HOA president." The room went silent for a moment, then erupted into a flurry of voices. People were nodding, whispering in agreement, while Karen's face twisted in horror. "You can't be serious," she sputtered, rising to her feet. "I have dedicated years to this community. I have made sacrifices. You stole firewood, ruined the bonfire, and nearly started a neighborhood riot," someone called from the back. "You fine people for having garden gnomes," another added. You wrote me up for leaving my porch light on too late, a woman chimed in. You banned lemonade stands, a kid shouted, and that was the final straw. The room erupted in boos, people shaking their heads, laughing, calling for the vote to be taken immediately. Barbara, barely containing her smile, stood up. All in favor of removing Karen from her position? Hands shot up across the room. More than half. More than enough. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She turned to the crowd, desperate, trying to salvage her last shred of control. You're making a mistake. You need me. This community needs me. But nobody was listening. The vote had been cast. It was over. Karen let out an inhuman noise, a mixture of frustration and disbelief, and stormed out of the community center. The moment the doors slammed shut behind her, the room erupted into cheers. That night, I sat on my porch, a fresh pile of legally owned firewood stacked beside me. The air was crisp, the sky clear, the kind of perfect evening for a small personal bonfire. As I watched the flames flicker and dance, a few neighbors stopped by, laughing, sharing a drink, reveling in the victory of the day. Karen's reign was over. The HOA was free. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood actually felt like a community again. I raised my cup of hot cider, smiling to myself. Here's to justice, I murmured, tossing another log into the fire. And for once, I could enjoy it in peace.